There are decisions that define a man's farming career. Choices made in dealer lots under fluorescent lights, surrounded by salesmen who smell commission and bankers who smell risk. Moments where pride, ambition, and stubborn conviction collide with numbers on a spreadsheet that don't care about your feelings. Spring 1998. Gary Hofstetter stood in a Massey Ferguson dealer lot outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, staring at 160 horsepower wrapped in red and silver paint. The 8160. Mechanical front-wheel drive, Perkins turbocharged diesel, 24 forward speeds, built in Coventry, England with the kind of engineering that made American row crop tractors look like they were assembled by committee. Gary farmed 2,400 acres of corn and soybeans in Johnson County. Third-generation operation, good ground, manageable debt. His father had run Alice Chalmers Iron until the brand died, then switched to International Harvester until that brand died too. Gary had spent the last decade running a mixed fleet, an aging John Deere 4960, a Case IH 7140 with transmission issues, and a versatile 876 that burned oil like it was going out of style. He needed one good tractor. One reliable workhorse that could pull a 12-row planter in spring and run a grain cart all harvest without breaking his spirit or his bank account. The Massey Ferguson 8160 sat there like a European athlete in a Midwestern parking lot. Everything about it looked different: the cab design, the hood profile, the way the fenders flowed into the body. It didn't look like Iowa. It looked like it had opinions. The dealer, a man named Rick Kohler, who'd been selling Massey Ferguson equipment since the company still had Harris in the name, walked Gary around the machine with the careful enthusiasm of someone who knew this sale could go either way. "Engine's a Perkins T6.354, Rick said, tapping the hood. 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel. Same basic architecture they've been running since the 1960s. They know how to build these motors, Gary. They don't reinvent the wheel every 3 years like the other guys." Gary nodded. He'd done his research. The Perkins engine had a reputation. Bulletproof if you maintained it. Parts availability worldwide. British engineering with a farmer's sensibility. Built to run, not to impress engineers at a trade show. "What's the weakness?" Gary asked. Rick didn't hesitate. "The brand name. You're buying a tractor nobody around here runs. Your neighbors are going to ask questions. The co-op's going to make jokes. And if something breaks, you're waiting for parts to come from God knows where instead of pulling off a John Deere sitting in someone's shed. But mechanically, it's a tank. The Dyna 4 transmission is proven. The hydraulics are simple. The cab is comfortable. And that Perkins engine will still be running when your grandkids are old enough to drive it." Gary looked at the price sheet. $87,500. Not cheap, but cheaper than the equivalent John Deere 8300 by nearly $15,000, and cheaper than the Case IH MX240 by even more. He called his banker that afternoon. Tom Brenner had been the ag loan officer at First Security Bank in Coralville for 19 years. He knew every farmer in Johnson County by their debt-to-asset ratio and their handshake. Gary Hofstetter was a good risk. Conservative. Paid early when he could, never over-leveraged. But Tom didn't like the Massey Ferguson. "You're buying British iron in John Deere country," Tom said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of posture that suggested this conversation was a formality, not a negotiation. "What happens when you need parts? What happens when you want to trade it in 3 years and nobody wants a used Massey Ferguson?" "It's cheaper up front," Gary said. "Same horsepower as the Deere. Better engine reputation. I'm saving $15,000 right now. And losing $15,000 on resale later." "Gary, you're not thinking this through. Equipment holds value because other people want to buy it. You think a farmer in Iowa is going to pay top dollar for a British tractor when he can get a John Deere?" "The Perkins engine. I don't care if it's powered by prayers and diesel fuel. I care about collateral. I care about resale. I care about whether I can recover my loan if things go sideways. And a Massey Ferguson 8160 is not the kind of collateral that makes me sleep well at night." Gary felt his jaw tighten. "So you're saying no?" Tom sighed. "I'm saying I'll approve the loan because you've got the equity and the track record. But I'm also saying this is a mistake. You're buying emotion, not economics. That tractor looks different, and you like that it looks different. But different doesn't harvest corn. Gary signed the paperwork 3 days later. His father showed up at the farm the morning the 8160 was delivered. Harold Hofstetter was 71 years old, still farming 400 acres of his own ground, still waking up at 4:30 a.m., because that's what farmers did. He stood in the machine shed doorway, arms crossed, watching the dealership truck back the Massey Ferguson down the ramps. "You bought red iron," Harold said. "It wasn't a question." "I bought horsepower and reliability," Gary said. "You bought a tractor nobody around here can fix." Rick says the dealer supports it. Rick says a lot of things when he's trying to make a sale. What's he going to say when that transmission locks up in the middle of May and the parts are on a boat from England? Gary turned to face his father. "I did the research. This is a good machine." "I didn't say it wasn't a good machine. I said it was a stupid decision. There's a difference." Harold left before the truck did. The first season with the 8160 was flawless. Gary ran it hard through spring planting. 12-row corn planter, 200-bushel liquid fertilizer tank, pulling steady in third gear without a complaint. The Perkins engine never lugged. The cab stayed cool even when the temperatures hit 90. The hydraulics responded like they were reading his mind. He ran it through bean planting in June, switched to field cultivation in July. By August, he'd put 340 hours on the tractor and hadn't touched anything but the fuel cap and the oil dipstick. At the co-op in Swisher, he caught hell anyway. "How's that British tractor running?" asked Dennis Clausen, a neighbor who ran 3,000 acres of corn and more John Deere iron than most dealerships carried in inventory. He said it loud enough that half the grain pit could hear. "Running fine," Gary said. "Wait till something breaks. You'll be waiting 6 weeks for parts while the rest of us keep planting." "Haven't broken yet." "Yet," Dennis repeated, grinning. Gary didn't take the bait. He loaded his seed corn and left. But the comment sat in his chest like bad coffee. Because Dennis wasn't wrong about the risk. Gary had bought into a brand that didn't have infrastructure in Iowa. If something catastrophic failed, if the transmission grenaded or the rear end seized, he'd be dead in the water, waiting for parts that might have to clear customs before they cleared his county line. He'd made a bet, and so far, the bet was paying off. Harvest 1998 was perfect. Gary ran the 8160 with a grain cart, pulling a 750-bushel J&M cart through fields that yielded 178 bushels per acre on corn and 52 on soybeans. The tractor never hesitated, never overheated, never gave him a reason to second guess. By December, he'd put 680 hours on the machine. He changed the oil, greased the zerks, checked the coolant. The 8160 sat in the shed like it was waiting for round 2. At church, Gary ran into Tom Brenner, the banker who'd warned him off the purchase. "How's that Massey Ferguson treating you?" Tom asked. "No complaints," Gary said. "Good. Let's hope it stays that way." Tom didn't sound convinced. 1999 started strong. Corn prices were steady at $2.30 a bushel. Soybeans held at 5.10 tenths. Gary planted 1,400 acres of corn and 1,000 acres of beans. The 8160 ran through spring fieldwork like it had been doing it for decades. He even started to relax, started to think maybe he'd been right and everyone else had been wrong. Then August hit. Corn futures started dropping. Oversupply, too much production, not enough demand. By September, corn was trading under $2 a bushel. Soybeans fell to $4.75. Gary's projected revenue for the year dropped by $110,000 in 6 weeks. He tightened his belt, cut discretionary spending, delayed equipment maintenance on the older tractors. The 8160 kept running, which was good because he couldn't afford for it not to. Harvest came in strong, 182 bushels per acre on corn, 54 on beans. But the prices gutted him. By the time he sold his grain in December, he'd barely covered operating costs. There was nothing left over for equipment payments, nothing left over for next year's seed budget. Tom Brenner called him in January 2000. "We need to talk about your loan," Tom said. Gary sat across from Tom in the same office where he'd signed the papers for the 8160 18 months earlier. The desk looked the same. The chair felt different. "You're 60 days behind on the tractor payment," Tom said. "I know. You want to tell me why?" Commodity prices tanked. You know that. I also know you're still farming 2,400 acres and you've got equipment sitting in your shed that's worth money. You could sell something, liquidate some iron, get current on your loans. Gary shook his head. I sell a tractor. I can't farm the ground. I can't farm the ground. I can't make the payment anyway. So what's your plan? Prices come back. They always come back. Tom didn't look convinced. Gary, I'm giving you 90 days to get current. After that, I have to escalate this. That means collections. That means we start talking about collateral. The 8160's collateral. The 8160's worth $60,000 used if I'm lucky. You owe $74,000. That's a problem. Gary felt his stomach drop. You said it would lose value. You didn't say it would lose that much value. Welcome to British Iron in Iowa. Nobody wants to buy what nobody wants to own. Gary went home and did the math. He was underwater on the Massey Ferguson by $14,000. He owed $74,000 on a tractor that wouldn't bring $60,000 at auction. Even if he sold it, he'd still owe the bank the difference, and he wouldn't have a primary tractor to farm with. He was trapped. The machine that was supposed to be his financial advantage had become his financial anchor. He called Rick Kohler, the dealer who'd sold him the 8160. I need to know what it's worth on trade, Gary said. Rick didn't sugarcoat it. On trade, maybe $55,000. Private sale, you might get $62,000 if you find the right buyer. But Gary, nobody's buying right now. Commodity prices have everyone spooked. Used equipment's not moving. So I'm stuck. You're not stuck. You've got a good tractor. You just bought it at the wrong time. That doesn't help me make the payment. No, Rick admitted. It doesn't. Spring 2000. Gary scraped together enough cash to get current on the loan. He sold a grain bin, sold an old disc harrow, sold his backup pickup truck. He made the payment, barely, and planted his crop with the 8160, pulling the same 12-row planter it had pulled 2 years earlier. The tractor still ran flawlessly. That was the worst part. It wasn't failing him mechanically. It was failing him financially. Every hour he put on the 8160 was an hour that depreciated a machine he couldn't afford to keep and couldn't afford to sell. At the co-op, Dennis Clausen saw him fueling up. Still running that Massey Ferguson? Dennis asked. Still running, Gary said. Heard you're behind on payments. Gary felt his face flush. Where'd you hear that? Small county. People talk. People should mind their own business. Dennis shrugged. Just saying, you buy iron nobody wants. Don't be surprised when nobody wants to help you out of it. Gary finished fueling and left before he said something he'd regret. By harvest 2000, Gary had put over 1,400 hours on the 8160. The tractor still ran, the engine still pulled, the transmission still shifted smooth. But every time he climbed into that cab, he thought about the $74,000 he owed on a machine worth $55,000. He thought about Tom Brenner's warnings. He thought about his father's words. You bought a stupid decision. Corn prices stayed low. Soybeans didn't recover. By the end of 2000, Gary was 3 months behind on the payment again. Tom Brenner called him in February 2001. We're done waiting, Tom said. You're in default. We're moving to repossess the tractor. Give me one more season. I gave you one more season. I gave you 2. This is over, Gary. The bank's taking the 8160. We'll sell it at auction, and you'll owe us the difference. How much? Depends on what it brings. Probably $15,000 to $20,000 after the sale. Gary felt his throat tighten. I'll lose the tractor and still owe you money. That's what happens when you buy a tractor nobody wants. The auction was set for March 15, 2001. Gary didn't attend. He couldn't stomach watching strangers paw over the machine he'd believed in, the machine he'd defended, the machine that had run perfectly for 3 years and still betrayed him. Rick Kohler called him the next day. It sold for $51,000, Rick said. Gary did the math in his head. He still owed the bank $23,000 on a tractor he no longer owned. Who bought it? Gary asked. Guy from Wisconsin. Said he's been looking for an 8160 for 2 years. Couldn't find one in decent shape. So it was worth something. It was worth something to him. It wasn't worth enough to you. Gary hung up. Spring 2001. Gary farmed with borrowed equipment. His father loaned him the old International Harvester 5488. A neighbor loaned him a John Deere 4960 with a blown turbo. He scraped through planting. He scraped through harvest. He made just enough to stay afloat. The $23,000 he still owed on the Massey Ferguson sat on his balance sheet like a scar. He made minimum payments. The bank didn't push. They'd already humiliated him enough. At church, Harold Hofstetter finally said something. "You learned an expensive lesson," Harold said. "Yeah," Gary muttered. "You bought a good tractor at the wrong time. That's not the tractor's fault. That's yours." "I know. You thought being different made you smart. Being different just made you alone." Gary didn't argue. He couldn't. By 2003, Gary had rebuilt his operation. He bought a used John Deere 8200, not because it was better than the Massey Ferguson 8160, but because it was what banks would finance and neighbors would recognize. He farmed cautiously. He avoided risk. He never bought new equipment again. Tom Brenner retired in 2005. At his retirement party at the co-op, he saw Gary and walked over. "You still mad at me about that Massey Ferguson?" Tom asked. "No," Gary said. "You were right." "I wasn't right about the tractor. I was right about the risk. There's a difference." "Doesn't feel like much of a difference from where I'm standing." Tom nodded. "You know what the real mistake was? You bought a tractor you couldn't afford to be wrong about. If that 8160 had been a John Deere and you'd gone underwater on it, you could have traded it in, eaten the loss, and moved on. But because it was British iron in Iowa, you were stuck. The mistake wasn't the tractor. The mistake was thinking the tractor was the only variable." Gary had thought about that conversation 1,000 times since. In 2008, Gary was fueling up at the co-op when he saw a familiar silhouette roll past on a flatbed trailer. Red and silver paint, Perkins diesel hood, mechanical front-wheel drive axle. His 8160, still running, still working, now owned by someone in Wisconsin who'd probably never had a single financial regret about buying it. Dennis Clausen walked up beside him. "That the same Massey Ferguson you bought back in '98? Dennis asked. "Yeah," Gary said. "Still running, huh?" "Still running." Dennis shook his head. "You know what the problem was? You bought the right tractor in the wrong county. That machine would have been fine in Wisconsin or Montana. But in Iowa, you might as well have bought a tractor from Mars." Gary watched the flatbed disappear down Highway 30. "I bought it because I thought I was smarter than everyone else," Gary said. "Turns out I was just more stubborn." "There's a difference?" Dennis asked, grinning. Gary didn't answer. By 2010, Gary had paid off the remaining $23,000 he'd owed on the Massey Ferguson 8160. It took 9 years. 9 years of extra payments on a machine he didn't own. 9 years of watching that line item on his balance sheet like a tombstone. His father died in 2012. At the funeral, Gary stood in front of the casket and thought about the morning Harold had watched the 8160 get delivered. The morning Harold had called it a stupid decision. Harold had been right. But not because the tractor was bad, because Gary had bought pride instead of pragmatism. He'd bought a machine that made him feel different instead of a machine that made him financially secure. That was the lesson. And it cost him $23,000 and 3 years of sleep to learn it. Today, Gary Hofstetter still farms in Johnson County, Iowa. He runs John Deere Iron now. Nothing fancy. Nothing foreign. He makes his payments. He keeps his head down. He doesn't stand out. And somewhere in Wisconsin, a Massey Ferguson 8160 with a Perkins turbocharged diesel is still running, still pulling, still proving that it was a good tractor, just not in Iowa. And not for Gary. The dealer tried to warn him. The banker tried to warn him. His father tried to warn him. But Gary Hofstetter bought that Massey Ferguson 8160 anyway, because he thought horsepower and engineering were enough. They weren't. And by the time he learned that lesson, it was too late to get his money back. Too late to get his pride back. Too late to undo the decision that made him the cautionary tale whispered about in co-ops and dealer lots across Johnson County for the next decade. "Remember Gary Hofstetter," they'd say. "Remember that British tractor he bought?" They remembered. And so did Gary. Every time he made a payment on a machine he didn't own. Every time he saw red and silver paint on a trailer passing through town. Every time someone asked him why he ran green iron now instead of something different. He'd bought the Massey Ferguson 8160 against every warning. And what happened next didn't destroy the tractor. It destroyed his pride. And in farming, that's the only thing more expensive than bad equipment. It's the only thing you can't finance, can't trade in, and can't sell at auction. You just carry it for the rest of your career, for the rest of your life. Gary Hofstetter carried that weight for 12 years. And somewhere in Wisconsin, the tractor he should have never bought kept running, kept working, kept proving that sometimes being right about the machine doesn't mean you were right about the decision. And in farming, that difference is everything.